Now on 4, David Jessel sets out to expose a miscarriage of justice, trial and error.
It was an evening in early spring, 1985. All over the country, families like the Adamses were settling down to enjoy the top-rating television drama of the time. A normal end to an unexceptional day. But unknown to the family and to the other villagers of Bestwood near Nottingham, the final act of a genuine tragedy was unfolding in the deepening shadows just outside. A 10-year-old boy had been assaulted and strangled. His murderer was about to throw him, inert but still alive, into the River Leen. But the killer, Philip Atherton, ruined a second life, that of a totally innocent man, Mark Cleary, who today is also serving a life sentence for this crime, which he did not commit.
Well, it's an average sort of a day out there. We're all hoping the weather improves in time for the Easter holiday, except possibly the customs officers. Apparently they're all going on a work to rule. Is dead or alive?
It was the Wednesday before Easter, 8 years ago. Philip Atherton had been drinking heavily at lunchtime. The 21-year-old left work early, cycling to the Bestwood council estate on the outskirts of Nottingham, where he used to live. Outside the local shops, he got talking with Wayne Keeton, a 10-year-old still thrilled with the BMX bike he'd got for Christmas. For several hours, the young man and the boy were seen together on and off by more than 20 witnesses. They seemed to be planning a bike ride. As evening drew on and Wayne didn't come home, the family began to worry. By the next day, their concern became public.
This is a police message regarding missing from home Wayne Keeton.
Later that day came the first clue. Wayne's bike was discovered here at the end of a lonely path just above Bestwood village, some 2 miles from the council estate. And on the day after that, Good Friday, police searching the area discovered a shoe belonging to Wayne.
The search for Wayne Keeton, the missing Nottinghamshire schoolboy, has continued today with volunteers helping police comb the countryside where he disappeared.
More than 1,000 people turned out on a wet and windy day. They trekked across
Over Easter weekend, this local concern became national news as the local community turned out in force to look for the boy. Philip Atherton joined the search. Indeed, from the very day of Wayne's disappearance, he seemed to have had a curious fascination with the matter. Rob Smith remembers him on the day after the murder and before the boy's fate was known, making him a strange and sinister offer.
And he asked me if I wanted to buy a red, yellow BMX bike.
So he offered you the boy's bike. How much was he asking for it?
£25, I believe.
This is the day after the murder, before the body's been found, and he's actually trying to sell you the boy's bike.
That's right, yeah.
On Sunday evening, the boy's body was discovered by police frogmen here in the River Leen, jammed under a low bridge. The following day, Philip Atherton was taken in for questioning. Almost immediately, Atherton broke down and admitted to the killing. The confession he sobbed out was extraordinarily detailed, and we believe that this is the closest the man ever got to telling the full truth of his terrible crime. The lies would come later. But for the meantime, this is what happened, according to that original confession. Atherton said he and young Wayne had travelled the 2 miles along the disused railway line which runs between the council estate and Bestwood village. By the time it got dark, They'd arrived at a lonely path behind the village. He says he grew tired of the boy's company and told him to go home. But Wayne hung on and kept following him.
I said, keep away from me.
Atherton said he then lost his temper, lashed out at the boy, tried to choke him, knocked him to the ground. He told the police in precise and graphic detail how he attempted a sexual assault on the injured and bleeding child. Then, and again we're following his statement, he said he'd put the boy's semi-conscious body over the crossbar of his bike. Now began a macabre and mysterious journey, with Atherton wheeling the child along the narrow, rugged and thorny path for the best part of a mile. When he got to this steep 45-degree slope down off the railway embankment, he somehow managed to get the boy and bike down across the busy main road, past the Adams family and their quiet evening at home without once being seen. And finally down to the River Leen. He said he wanted to wash the blood off the child's face. But according to his statement, he was panicked by a sudden shout and ran off. The boy, he said, must then have rolled into the water, from where he would have drifted away, eventually lodging under the bridge some 100 yards downstream. Stephen Jones was the Home Office pathologist called in to conduct a post-mortem. He found that although the boy had been strangled and beaten and had suffered a potentially fatal rupture of the spleen, none of that was the actual cause of death.
We had to carry out some specialised tests. If a person is alive when they go in the water, in inhaling water, and in the water there are little animals called diatoms. And so we submitted organs for a special test to Aldermaston for Dr. Peabody, who is the international expert on this investigation, and he was able to identify that diatoms were present in organs. So ultimately the child died as a result of drowning, and that the other potential causes, in fact, were not the actual causes of death.
The killing devastated an already disheartened community. The Bestwood area flourished or fell according to the fortunes of coal. Now, with the pit closed down and the colliery buildings demolished, the heart has gone out of the place. There's a lot of enforced idleness, and little work except for that which traditionally comes to idle hands. It's a harsh, rough place. There's a lot of crime, not all of it petty. For those who knew Philip Atherton, there was a terrible predictability to his crime. On the reclaimed slag heap high above the village and the murder scene, we met David Evans. Evans was not much older than Wayne Keeton at the time of the murder, one of a group of children over whom the older Atherton held an almost magical sway.
He couldn't, get the kind of respect he wanted off the big people, you know what I mean? So he used to, people like me look up to him, do you know what I mean? I used to idol him at one time, you know what I mean?
You used to idolise him? Yeah.
He used to, play everything, commandos, everything, you know what I mean? Go on bikes in the choir, everything, go everywhere.
But he'd always be with younger children?
Yeah, all the time. He was never with anyone his own age.
Tell me more about this sort of power he had over children.
It just used to make you believe things, and it weren't even sensible things either. Not when I look at it now, you know what I mean? It was like things that could never happen, do you know what I mean? He'd just say it, do you know what I mean? Just to hype you up, so you'd follow him anyway. He would. So it could get you to go anywhere, you know what I mean? It could me anyway, and it could quite a few other people I could mention, you know what I mean?
Can you understand then how Wayne Keeton followed him that night?
No problem, yeah, I can understand that fully. Well, we used to go down to the pit baths and mess around in there, do you know what I mean? And he used to just neck the pigeon, just chuck it up in there, so we used to fly around, do you know what I mean? Until eventually it just dropped to the floor, and there's blood everywhere, do you know what I mean? I could never do it, you know what I mean? But he used to do it all the time.
Now it seemed the little tortures with which Atherton had kept the children of Bestwood in awe had culminated in the ultimate act of cruelty. Anger turned to fury as Atherton was committed for trial.
As people rushed to the dock, police had to restore order. Scores of angry people waited outside for the defendant to be driven to prison, but police took him out through a back door into an unmarked car. They avoided most of the crowd by driving through an adjoining fire station.
The case against Atherton seemed as simple as anything this terrible could be. But after 7 weeks, while Atherton was awaiting trial, something happened which utterly transformed the inquiry. It happened after Atherton's father and his girlfriend Teresa came to see him in prison. We have a record of what happened on that prison visit. In the interview room, Mr. Atherton told his son, "I think another person was probably with you." Philip said nothing for about 2 minutes and then said, "Yes, okay, Dad." His father then said, "I want a name." Within a week after Mr. Atherton had informed his son's solicitors, Atherton was visited again by the police. He told them he wanted to revise his story. This time he put the responsibility for the worst aspects of Wayne's killing on someone he'd never even mentioned to the police before. Mark Cleary. It's hard to think of anything that could make the murder of a child like Wayne Keeton more wretched still, except that an innocent man be punished for it. Pleasure and power both play their part in a killing like this, and we believe that the man who killed young Wayne still enjoys the privilege of controlling another person's fate, by falsely accusing Mark Cleary and condemning him to share his shame and punishment for a crime we believe he did not commit. In his new version of events, Philip Atherton still confesses to the murder, but now his story totally transforms his part in it. Instead of being alone, this time he takes his old school friend Cleary along with him.
I said go away! Go back home, I've nothing to do with you, all right?
And according to this version, it's now Cleary who instigates the more perverted aspects of the attack.
Get away from me!
In an earlier interview, you stated that you wanted to sexually assault him. You're now saying it was Mark's idea, which is right.
It was Mark's idea. He started to kick Wayne in his side and stomach while he was on the floor. I managed to pull Mark away. He was calling me a bastard and told me to let him go.
Back off, man! Hold down! Back off! You don't hit me! Leave me out!
But as well as Atherton's accusation, there was just one other suspicious event which seemed to link Mark Cleary to the crime. And it happened right here on this path. 2 days after the boy went missing, Mark Cleary went along with his old friend Philip Atherton on what Atherton must have known was a grotesque charade, joining the search for the boy, whose body, of course, he had disposed of less than 48 hours earlier. The discovery the day before of Wayne's BMX in the bushes on the railway embankment was the first breakthrough the police had had. The inquiry suddenly had a focus in an intensive search of the embankment and surrounding fields. A team of 30 policemen conducted a day-long fingertip search, but they found nothing. Immediately the police had left, 2 young men, apparently intent on helping with the search for the body, began their own search along the same 200-yard-long path. They each took a side, picking their way carefully through the undergrowth. At the end, having found nothing, they turned round, swapping sides to double-check each other's efforts. Halfway back, one of them found a boy's shoe lying in the grass.
Mark!
The one who found it was Philip Atherton. His friend, who'd already checked that side, finding nothing, was Mark Cleary. According to Cleary, Atherton urged him to tell the police, but Cleary assumed that if they hadn't taken it, it couldn't be that important. To those who knew Philip Atherton well, this apparently chance discovery fits a curious quirk of his character.
Because that's the sort of person Philip was. I mean, he used to, you know, his petty things, pinching. He'd pinch something and then, so what he'd say, well, they're getting the police, this has gone missing, and he'd find it.
If he stole something, he'd find it the next day for you. The whole police force could be looking for it, but he'd find it. He ran my cat over, and then and then helped me to go looking for it.
You what?
He then helped me to go looking for it, even though he knew the cat was dead and he'd got rid of it. But he still helped me to go looking for it.
Mark!
The police can't have known, as seen in the cells in the adjoining police station. The day after Atherton's new version of events, Mark Cleary was told to wait in the staff room. He had a couple of visitors. The police had come to arrest him. Cleary was taken to Hucknall police station for interview. The officer originally in charge of the case was away on holiday. He'd assumed, reasonably enough, that Atherton's arrest tied up the case. So Cleary was interviewed by another senior officer, Chief Superintendent Philip Newton. Newton interviewed Cleary without taking notes of any kind and without a solicitor being present. The law at this stage had not been changed to make such interviewing techniques invalid. After more than 2 hours, during which there's no record of what was said or done, the account of the conversation states that Cleary began to make admissions. He told a story which seemed to echo Atherton's in many essential details, yet it was strangely incomplete, and it contained a number of points which didn't tally with Atherton's statement or which simply couldn't be true. When at last he was able to see a solicitor, Mark Cleary turned to the Nottingham firm of Cleggs. We went to see the man who took on his case, still fighting to prove his client's innocence 8 years on.
Well, Mark had never been in the situation like that before. He'd never been under arrest. He was petrified. He was questioned closely by 2 senior police officers in a way which isn't allowed anymore, of course. He held out during a couple of the interviews, but he felt such pressure eventually that he confessed because it was clear that's what the police were looking for.
On the 28th of January 1986, Mark Cleary came up these stairs to stand trial here in Court Number 1. It was a place he knew well. He'd polished these benches often enough. From this dock, both men pleaded not guilty. Atherton because he claimed Cleary had caused the boy's death, Cleary because he said he had nothing to do with it. The case against Cleary consisted only of a disputed and unsigned confession, which he denied as soon as making it. There was no scientific evidence, no sightings of him and the boy together. But thin though the evidence may have been, the atmosphere surrounding the trial was thick with anger and vengeance.
The atmosphere in the city, perhaps it's emotional for me to say, was electric, because there were banner headlines in the local paper. They were on a daily basis, very often accompanied by a fairly large photograph of the little boy, the poor victim of this offence. And there was no doubt at all, because of gasps and the odd noise from the public gallery about which side the public were on.
The jury found both men guilty, and the judge imposed the only sentence available, indeed the only sentence suitable for such a crime, life imprisonment. We share the horror at that crime, and in the case of Philip Atherton, we believe that justice was done. But the case of Mark Cleary is something else. When trial and error began to investigate, we began to uncover some strange and disturbing aspects to the case. For one thing, we now believe that Wayne Keeton was alive up to 2 hours after the court was told the child had been left for dead.
Until his conviction, Mark Cleary had lived an uneventful life. That was his undoing when the jury came to consider his alibi.
But today the jury of 7 women and 5 men at Nottingham Crown Court didn't believe his version, that he had been at home at the time playing records.
Cleary said he'd been home, as he often was, with a friend called Michael Ryan. Apart from Ryan, it was just the word of his parents. Michael Ryan was just 15 at the time. He'd been terrified by the responsibility laid upon him here in the witness box. Then, as now, he simply couldn't remember what he'd been doing 8 months before.
No, I can't remember nothing. Nothing what they said.
I mean, at the time they were asking you if you could remember being with Mark Cleary on that night. Could you remember anything?
No, I couldn't, no. Honestly, to God, I couldn't. I wish I could, like, but I couldn't.
How frightening was it?
Well, after I said my bit, and then I walked down these stairs here, then there was a big brown door just there, and a brass knob, doorknob, and I couldn't turn it. It just, you know, just went. I couldn't turn it, and the bloke was beside the door. He'd done it for me, you know, to let me out the court. It was scary.
Why couldn't you turn the handle?
And my hands were so sweaty, you know.
The unsupported alibi sank Mark Cleary. It was the first in a catalogue of legal errors, according to the distinguished QC Anthony Scrivener, who reviewed the case for trial and error.
Nowadays, a very careful direction is given in alibi cases. The jury are told by a judge that just because they disbelieve the alibi, they cannot assume from that that a defendant is guilty. Normally, judges will go on to say that there are many reasons why an alibi may fail. It may be because witnesses' recollections are wrong, or it may even be worse than that. It may be that the man, out of panic, even though he'd be innocent, has got together with other people to try and fabricate the evidence, because alibis are notoriously difficult. And most nowadays, jurors are warned about that. They are not to assume that he's guilty if the alibi fails.
So that warning would have been given today, but obviously wasn't given then.
There was no alibi warning of that sort. Here, in fact, I see in one particular passage, the judge is saying that if the prosecution satisfy you the alibi is false, then it makes the defendant's position worse. So that would not nowadays on its own suffice.
Still, there were those admissions, made though subsequently denied after his arrest at the Shire Hall. Mark Cleary had been taken to the police station at Hucknall, some 25 minutes' drive away. Here, he denied knowing anything about the killing for more than 2 hours of questioning before he began to make admissions. Admissions which he withdrew at various stages during the interview and which he retracted fully and finally as soon as he was able to see a legal advisor. He refused to sign a statement. The only record we have is this incomplete yet apparently verbatim account of the conversation. Nowadays, these interviews would have been thrown out as being in breach of PACE, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. But in those days, all the officers concerned were guilty of was breaching this set of guidelines. It's an unambiguous direction from the desk of the Chief Constable himself.
I have decided to introduce the taking of contemporaneous notes into force procedures as from the 1st of August 1983. Every effort should be made to comply with these instructions.
No effort at all was made. Nonetheless, these admissions make chilling reading, and even though he denies having committed the crime, Mark Cleary has never denied speaking these words, saying only that he spoke them because of the pressure he felt to comply with the interviewing officers. Cleary's supervisor when he worked at the Shire Hall was Brian Birchnell.
How do you think he would have stood up to the pressure of a police interview?
In my personal opinion, not 1 second. He couldn't handle it like that. Not in my personal opinion. The only young lad, of course, very green, very immature in ways. And I've only got to raise my voice 1 octave, and his bottom lip, or tears have come through his eyes.
I think good practice in this case would have demanded that once Atherton had implicated Cleary, 2 teams of interviewers should have been made up. One should have dealt separately with Atherton, and the other should have dealt separately with Cleary. And at the end of the process, their results should have been compared.
Now, the senior detective in both cases was different, but the second detective was present at both interviews. What would be the danger there?
Well, you've got a means of carrying information from one set of interviews, to the other set, of having somebody present who can say, but so-and-so said, or, but what about? In other words, easing the second suspect in a way which makes him, or pushes him towards fitting with the story of the first.
So this is a sort of transfer of information.
And it needn't be conscious.
The police account of the interview was crucial, but it's a fictional reconstruction of what was actually said. We're not saying the police officers lied, but we can show that because no notes were taken during the interview, the report can't be what it purports to be, an accurate, precise and verbatim script of that damning conversation. We went to Birmingham University, for an appointment with the country's leading expert in the analysis of language. He's looked at the words of the statement and what lies behind them.
The crucial second interview, which includes a few pauses for refreshment and so on, is logged as lasting 2 hours and 5 minutes. When we read out the script, as it were, we couldn't make it last much longer than 25 minutes. Does that surprise you?
Taking out the breaks, what we've got here is a record of possibly a 10th or at most a 5th of what was actually said.
A 10th or a 5th of what was actually said?
That's right, yes. I mean, that is why it takes such a short time for you to read.
But the record purports to be very accurate. There are colloquialisms, there are dialect words. Doesn't that give it all the ring of truth?
Yes, it does, indeed. I mean, we get variations. At one point, Cleary is recorded as saying, I am and I've done nothing. A little bit further down, he says, I've done nought wrong. He talks about me tea and me dad. Another page, he talks about my tea and my dad. It looks as if we've got great accuracy here in the representation. And we might believe this if it was taken down contemporaneously. But one couldn't remember with this degree of accuracy after the event. The experiments show that people can remember usually around about 1% of the actual words that were used, and possibly only about 25% of the actual content of what was said in an interaction.
Do you mean by the time I leave here and go back to Birmingham Station and I try to write down this conversation, I'll only get 1% of the words right?
Yes, if that, yes. And basically you will be acting as an amateur dramatist and you will be recreating the situation, you won't be recording it.
There's still a nagging doubt, though, about all the detail in Cleary's supposed admission. It seemed to describe what happened in a way that only someone who was there could actually know. That apparent mystery became clearer when we went to talk to people who lived in and around Bestwood. We discovered that within hours of Atherton's arrest, intimate details of the assault were common knowledge, the stuff of public gossip.
You saw Teresa shortly after Philip Atherton had been arrested.
Mm-hmm.
What, at that stage, and this was very, very early on, did you learn about the actual crime?
She said she tried to explain her version, what Atherton had obviously told her. She said that the little boy had been hassling Philip, and Philip had stood so much and then backhanded him, and she showed me with her hand. And the little boy fell to the ground, and Philip saw blood. So he took him, I'm sure she said on his handlebars, down to the river to clean him up. And while he was cleaning him up, obviously trying to wipe the blood away from his face, he heard somebody calling, and this prompted him to turn around quickly, and as he did, the little boy fell into the Lee.
So all these intimate details about the murder are really quite widely known throughout the estate within a matter of days.
Yeah, which is appalling, really.
And no mention of Mark, of course, Mark Cleary.
No mention of Mark Cleary at all. No.
There's a more practical reason to be sceptical of Atherton's attempt to implicate Mark Cleary, because he simply doesn't have time to commit the crime of which Atherton accused him. The court heard that he didn't leave work at the Shire Hall in the city centre till 8 o'clock. Flat out on his moped in clear traffic, the journey home would take him at least 20 minutes, so he couldn't have arrived at the scene of the fatal meeting with Wayne till 8:20. If that's the earliest start of the night's terrible events in Bestwood village, we also know the time by which, according to Atherton, the crime must have ended. He says he was wheeling his unconscious victim across the main road to the River Lean when he saw the 9:15 bus go by. So if Mark Cleary was involved, he'd have had, in theory, from 8:20 to 9:15 to plan and execute the murder. 25 minutes, from his meeting with Atherton and the boy at the Bestwood estate shops, along the old railway line, to carrying out the attack, and finally to seeing the bus on the edge of Bestwood village. But Atherton said his bike had a flat tyre, and that he, his intended victim, and Mark Cleary were walking. We were able to do something juries are seldom invited to do. We actually paced out the journey. Pushing bikes, it took 35 minutes, even to get to the scene of the first attack on the boy. Since Cleary can't have set off till 8:20, that takes us to 8:55, 5 to 9. And still the boy has to be loaded onto the bike, pushed all the way back along the path, then down the steep embankment to the road, a good 10 minutes effort, making it 9:05, just when Atherton claims to see the 9:15 bus going by. And that's allowing no time for the attack itself. It doesn't add up. We believe that for reasons only he can know, Atherton distorted the timetable of that terrible night. Reese Packard knew Philip Atherton well. Sometime after 11, he was driving home from his girlfriend's. The route took him along the street where Atherton lived.
As I turned the corner, I'd got my lights on because it was late, and I saw somebody just run into the edge as if they was trying to avoid me seeing them. So I drove into the car park and I saw nobody there. So it was suspicious at the time because they did run out the way to avoid me. It was obvious they'd been up to something or done something, or they was trying to hide from somebody.
You had a conversation with the police just a short while after seeing that shadowy figure. Can you tell me what that conversation was?
With the police? Well, I went down Moor Roads in my works van and I saw the police pulled up, so I just pulled up behind them and just asked them about the murder. And I said, have you got anyone for the murder? And he says, yes. And that's when I turned around and I says, is it Phil Atherton? Because of what I'd saw, and my suspicions thought it would be him, because it was outside his house that someone was acting suspicious.
And there's another flaw in Atherton's timetable, suggesting that the boy was alive way after 9:30, when Atherton said he was back home after carrying out the attack with Cleary. This house in Bestwood village is the home of Mr and Mrs Burgess. Their front windows look out across the busy main road and across other houses and barns towards the River Lee, and to the turning where, according to Atherton, he wheeled Wayne's body down past the Adamses' house to the waterside. On that April night, after a quiet evening at home watching television, Mrs Burgess and her husband went up to bed. Their bedroom is at the back of the house, overlooking the old railway embankments. From here, it's just a few hundred yards across open ground to the path where Wayne Keeton was attacked.
Well, it was about 11:10 when we went upstairs to bed. And it takes me a while to drop off, so I lay there. And I heard this noise, and it was somebody shouting, "Help me, help me." And I got up and I went to the window, opened the big window, and I stood for about 5 minutes, but I didn't hear anything after that at all. But it was definitely "help me, help me."
Can you describe exactly what it was like? Was it a man's voice, a woman's voice?
Well, I couldn't make out. It was more of a squeal, "Help me, help me." It could have been a little, you know, as we know now, it was a little boy, but it definitely wasn't a grown-up man's voice.
If you went up to bed at 11:10, have you any idea precisely when you heard that sound?
It was exactly 11:23.
How can you be so sure?
Because I looked at my watch. I don't know why, I just did.
And we discovered a terrible echo of the words that Mrs Burgess remembers hearing, "Help me, help me," in the first statement of Philip Atherton, when he describes the anguished plea of his victim. The practical impossibility of Cleary taking part in the murder in the time available. The late-night sighting of a man lurking in the bushes outside Atherton's house. Mrs Burgess's hearing of the cry. None of these issues were properly addressed at the trial, yet all point to the murder taking place at a time when Atherton says the attack was over and he was back home.
How might this knowledge have helped Mark Cleary at his trial? Well, the only evidence against Cleary was his supposed confession, and that's because it matched Philip Atherton's account. But it's hardly convincing evidence if it's merely an echo of things we've now discovered are untrue, a second-hand version of the lies of a self-confessed killer. And Atherton is a liar. There's a cunning about him which seems to be part of a long-laid plot, whose final act of evil, as we shall see, lay in loading the guilt for this terrible crime onto an innocent man.
Trial and Error's investigation has uncovered new evidence of a much later time than Atherton admitted for that night's dreadful deeds. Forge Farm is just 100 yards or so from the point where young Wayne was first attacked. For 8 years, a vital statement taken here has lain buried. That very night, and at the same time that Mrs. Burgess heard a cry, something happened to alert the inhabitants of Forge Farm.
Well, the dog woke us creating. I think I was asleep in the chair, and she was making quite a din. But she only makes that sort of noise if there's either somebody at the door or there's somebody about.
Mrs. Dawson, can you remember roughly what time this was?
It was late. It was well over, gone 11, if not later. I knew it should eventually quieten down, but we thought it was a shame we didn't go out, you know, at the time, but when we heard about it. But it wasn't to know, really.
In a murder inquiry, the police take a whole lot of statements from members of the public. But many of those statements are simply left on one side, because they don't particularly help the case. As far as the prosecution are concerned, they're irrelevant. But amazingly, these documents contain no less than 12 sightings of Wayne Keeton over a mile away from the scene of the attack, at a time when, according to Atherton's account, the pair had left the estate on their fatal journey. Some of these witnesses even say they saw the boy well after 9:30, the time when his killer, Philip Atherton, claims to have been home and in bed. 12 eyewitnesses in a murder case. But could they have been mistaken about the time? Hard to imagine them all being wrong, especially when many of them knew Wayne personally. And from 4 of these statements, never heard by the jury, trial and error has been able to reconstruct a compelling, intricate and new piece of evidence. 4 statements, all independently given within a couple of days of Wayne's disappearance and before any arrests had been made. Indeed, before it was even known that a murder had been committed. Each statement, taken alone, doesn't seem to say much, and that's maybe why the police didn't see their significance. Yet we've discovered that they all interlock. 4 statements, each corroborating the others and proving conclusively that Wayne was still alive and playing on the Bestwood estate at around 10 o'clock at night. And that's critical information. Because if that's the case, his murderer, Philip Atherton, who said he had done the deed and was home in bed by 9:30, is weaving a web of lies around his admitted guilt. The 4 people who made these statements, Teresa Cole and Susan Brealey, Steve Barnett and Michael Cleary, the brother of the man later to be accused of Wayne's murder, were all out and about on the estate on the evening of April the 3rd, 1985. Using actors to represent them as they were 8 years ago, we've rebuilt the crucial encounters of that night from the actual statements they made to the police at the time. Susan and Teresa, then aged 17 and 14, were hanging around, as they often did, for most of the evening outside the shops. In separate statements, they both talk of seeing Wayne and Philip Atherton, and actually speaking to them for almost 3/4 of an hour. They put the time at around 9:30 to 10 o'clock.
We've seen this little boy came by us, and he stopped and asked us the time.
What was the time, Teresa, when you told him?
It was about 9:45 when he asked me the time. I asked him where he was going. He said he was going to a friend's, and I told him to get home as soon as possible because it's dark and there's a load of naughty people about.
Now, Susan, one thing that isn't in your statement is how the evening ended. What did happen?
But the point is, I don't like walking home on my own. So a boy walked me home, but I can't remember who. But I got walking home by this boy. We took Teresa home, and then this guy walked me home, and that was it, really.
That seemed to chime with a statement we found had been taken from Steve Barnett on the very day after the boy disappeared. He said he'd met 2 young girls that evening, but he told the police he didn't know their names. We found his story matches that of Susan and Teresa exactly. He said he walked one of them part of the way home. Then he turned back with the other girl, crossing the main road and walking her, too, most of the way home. But it's the 4th statement of Michael Cleary, Mark Cleary's brother, that locks all the evidence together and proves that Susan and Teresa were right about the time they saw young Wayne. That evening, Michael had been out on the estate on his motorbike. In his statement, he says it was gone 10 o'clock when he ran into his old friend Steve Barnett, who was talking to two girls outside the shops. While they were chatting, a small boy rode past on a yellow and red BMX bike, wearing the clothes we know Wayne Keeton wore that night. This statement was freely given weeks before his brother Mark was to come under suspicion for a murder that nobody yet knew had taken place. It was only when trial and error brought together the real people involved that they, for the first time, recognised each other as those who had met that night 8 years ago. So the statements of these four each support the others on the crucial matter of timing, showing that the boy was clearly alive well after 9:30 when, according to Atherton, he had left the boy for dead and gone back home.
Dropping you off? Yeah, dropping me off first. We don't have to come get me.
Why should a man who admits to murder lie about the time he did it? Maybe because deception adds to the dreadful pleasure of the crime. Not the least terrible aspect of the death of Wayne Keeton is that for his murderer, it was only the start of a continuing game. It's one of the clichés of detective fiction that the murderer always returns to the scene of the crime. In this case, the truth goes way beyond the wildest imaginings of any crime story. In the 4 days between the murder of Wayne Keeton and his own arrest, Philip Atherton went back to the scene of his crime on at least 3 occasions. It's almost as if he was trying to attract suspicion, trying to flirt with fate. Mark. The whole saga of finding the boy's shoe now appears to be another example of Atherton toying with his guilt, with the added cunning of enmeshing Mark Cleary in his schemes. And when Cleary fails to take the bait and hand the shoe to the police, Atherton tries again. He actually took Cleary down to the bridge where Wayne's body was at that moment lying hidden, and played the obscenely innocent game of throwing pieces of wood into the water one side and getting Cleary to watch for it coming out the other. It wasn't the first time we discovered that Atherton had had a morbid assignation by the banks of the River Leen. Several weeks earlier, his girlfriend's dog had gone missing.
She had a dog that used to bark and awaken a family up to let them know what time she was in at night, which we're getting Teresa into trouble because she should have been in earlier. Then out of the blue, the dog went missing. Really? And who found it but Philip Atherton, drowned, dead, in a bag. He actually went out and said, oh, I found the dog, it was dead. Like, you know, and everyone thought, yeah, but, you know, but he done it sort of thing.
Terrible as it was, the crime of Philip Atherton was not unique. The interim secure unit of Bart's Hospital in London houses severely troubled men and women, some of whom have committed grave crimes. There were at least 4 homicide cases resident on the day we visited Dr. Jeremy Coyd, who oversees the unit.
Well, this sort of behaviour is not unknown in certain sexual offenders, but serious sexual offenders when there's a homicide involved, and there's indeed a phenomenon known to police in the case of serial killings. The actual taking part in the hunt, to some extent playing with the police, being at the scene of the crime. It's not an unknown phenomenon, and it often reflects the psychopathology of the offender, that having actually committed the offence, there's still some further pleasure to be gained and excitement from the process of playing with other people, with potential witnesses. The best example being the bridge.
You've prepared this psychological analysis of the 3 statements, the 2 of Atherton's, the 1 of Cleary's. What surprises me is that it does scant justice to the actual horror, the scale, the complexity of the events which we know occurred.
As a forensic psychiatrist, one often comes across statements made to the police in which the offender is at pains to minimise what they did. And this is for understandable reasons, because most individuals don't like to reveal actually how awful the things they've done actually are. What is strikingly missing from his second statement and that of Cleary's is any description on how they acted together in concert. The description of, say, how they might have restrained the child,
held him down, how they might have beaten him together. There's very little of that, and that's surprising.
Trial and error has also revealed a terrible method in Atherton's madness. All the time, it seems, even before he named Mark Cleary, he was laying plans to shift the shadow of suspicion onto innocent but vulnerable figures. Police statements reveal that Atherton was using the name Ady when he was loitering around the Bestwood estate. So when Wayne went missing, the search was on for the mysterious Ady. In the course of our investigation, we went to the allotment Atherton used to work. The next one along belonged to a man Atherton knew well. He's a man with learning difficulties. He suffers from epilepsy. According to a statement made by Atherton's girlfriend, Teresa Monti, Atherton actually told her, before he was arrested, to call the police and tip them off to the existence of this totally innocent man. His name is Adrian Rhodes. He calls himself Ady.
And police came round and showed me a little photo at Mark, Wayne Keeton. Police asked me if I'd seen him before. I was no, and I've seen him alive.
Did you know that Atherton's girlfriend rang the police and said, I know someone called Ady, and put the finger on you?
No, I didn't know about that. I didn't know at all.
What do you feel about that now that you do know?
Oh, terrible now.
8 years later, Trial and Error believes that at last we can disentangle the truth from the lies of Philip Atherton which ensnared Mark Cleary. We're convinced there were 2 attacks, both of them much later than Atherton pretended. One here which led to the desperate cry that Mrs Burgess heard at 11:23, but the fatal one right over by the river, where Atherton finished his brutal work. Both Atherton's accusation and Cleary's confession say that the final act of murder came when Atherton took the boy to the river alone. Nobody ever says Cleary was with him. The accusation was that he had kicked the child earlier, rupturing the child's spleen. It's an organ that bleeds easily, but the bleeding would have stopped as soon as he drowned. A clue possibly to the time and, crucially, the place of the attack. Alistair Wilson sees more traumatic damage to the human body than most. He's the emergency consultant with the London Hospital Flying Ambulance, dealing with many of the big traffic accidents in and around London. When he came to review the medical evidence for Trial and Error, Mr Wilson was puzzled by the relatively small amount of blood lost from the murder victim's damaged spleen. What did that say about where and when the attack took place?
I think the spleen, when it is burst like this, where you have a number of tears and where there is some bruising which has obviously occurred fairly quickly nearby into the tissues round about, I think one would have thought that the circulation must have stopped really within minutes of the injury having occurred. I mean, if one was given the choice of placing the injury before psychoride or indeed positionally where, one would put it, I think, close to the time of death. And from other evidence with the diatoms, I think we would have to put that close to the river bank.
Do you have a general feel about this case?
I have a great feeling of unease about this case. First of all, the whole case really depended upon a confession, which really can't be relied upon in the light of the experience we have nowadays. Secondly, a direction was given about the alibi, which more or less said if you disbelieve the alibi, I'm afraid that's the end of the case, which is not now correct. And then you had what we now know about the accuser, Atherton, that he had made similar allegations before in relation to somebody else, and the jury didn't know about that. So I'm very uneasy indeed about this case.
For 8 years now, Mark Cleary has been protesting that he is innocent. You knew the lad. Do you think he's capable of maintaining a lie for 8 years?
My personal opinion, no. No, I didn't believe he was guilty then, and I don't believe he's guilty now.
There are safeguards these days to protect people like Mark Cleary. Under them, his case would probably never even have come to court. But they came in too late for Cleary. He'll be in prison until the Home Secretary or Philip Atherton thinks fit.
I've been told by Teresa, with my husband as a witness, that Mark Cleary will stay where he is until at least the time Philip Atherton is released. When Philip Atherton is released, he may consider, this is in her words, getting Mark Cleary out. But surely if a man is innocent, he deserves all the help he can get.